Motion to proceed to calendar number 4S6, a bill to amend Title 18 United States Code to prohibit a healthcare practitioner from failing to exercise the proper degree of care in the case of a child who survives an abortion or attempted abortion.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to Senate 6 bill to amend the Title 18 United States Code to prohibit a health care practitioner from failing to exercise the proper degree of care in the case of a child who survives an abortion or attempted abortion shall be brought to a close. The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Banks. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Bennett. Mrs. Blackburn. Mr. Kim. Mr. Blumenthal. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Britt. Mr. Budd. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Hickenlooper. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Husted. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Justice. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kim. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lujan. Ms. Lummis. Mr. Markey. Mr. Marshall. Mr. McConnell. Thanks. Mr. McCormick. Mr. Merkley. Mrs. Moody. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Mullen. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Ossoff. Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative: Barrasso, Budd, Capito, Cassidy, Cornyn, Cotton, Crapo, Fisher, Grassley, Hoeven, Husted, Justice, Lankford, Moody, Moreno, Murkowski, Paul, Sullivan, and Tillis. Mrs. Britt, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Senators voting in the negative: Baldwin, Blunt Rochester, Duckworth, Kim, Murray, Peters, Rosen, and Smith. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Fetterman, no. Ms. Also Brooks, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Lujan, no. Ms. Lamas, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Ms. Hassan, no. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Van Hollen, no. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. King, no. Mr. McCormick, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Hickenlooper, no. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Coons, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Kennedy, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Bo Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Warnock, no. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Merkley? No. Mr. Cruz? Aye. Mr. Schmidt? Aye. Mr. Marshall? Aye. Mr. Whitehouse? No. Mr. Booker? No. Mr. Ossoff? No. Mr. Warner? No. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Lee, aye.
On this vote, the yeas are 52 and the nays are 47. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen are sworn, and sworn not having voted in the affirmative, the motion is not agreed to. Senator from Virginia.
Mr. President, let me begin by asking unanimous consent that Jermaine Jackson, Julia Brunel, Stephen Ramdalal, and Tracy Fasolino, who are fellows in my office, be granted floor privileges for the duration of their assignments to my office.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise as a member of the Armed Services Committee to discuss the nomination of Pete Hegseth to be our nation's Secretary of Defense. Let me make two preliminary comments. First, my philosophy about voting on nominees is to give deference to the President who has been elected, who has a mandate that carries with it a mandate to assemble a leadership team in executive positions. And so I always begin with any president, Democrat or Republican, with a beginning standpoint. They should be able to assemble a team unless there are significant challenges with a nominee. Second, I do want to say that as part of the work that I've done in examining this nominee, I did review his military record, and I express my respect for the military record. Pete Hegseth's service in the military, my review of those Pentagon records suggested that he served in a very honorable way, and I want to acknowledge that. And yet I rise to oppose the nomination and urge my colleagues to oppose it, or at least take the time to really understand the gravity of behavioral challenges that have been demonstrated by Mr. Hegseth during his career. I have multiple problems with this nominee for this position, and this position, Secretary of Defense, is the position that I view and many Virginians view as the most important cabinet post. Let me review the reasons for my opposition. First, Mr. Hegseth's record of erratic, unprofessional, and troubling behavior. Mr. Hegseth was married twice before he is married to his current wife, his third wife. And in the first two marriages, there were allegations in both of serious and multiple infidelities. I asked him at the hearing when he appeared before us whether he took an oath of fidelity to his spouses, and of course he did. In the same way that a Secretary of Defense will take an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States. But the evidence that was before us, the public record that was before us, is very, very troubling. In Mr. Hegseth's first marriage, there were public reports that he was unfaithful to his wife at least 5 different times with multiple other people. He never rebutted that, and because he wouldn't meet with members of the committee on the Democratic side, we didn't get a chance to talk about that in a closed setting, which would have been most important. In his second marriage, he was married, and while married, fathered a child by a woman who would be